At 40,000 feet, the first warning light came on, then another, and then all of them. The pilot had seconds to understand what was happening, seconds to interpret 7 simultaneous alerts, seconds to decide which one was real and which ones were noise. But this wasn't a normal system failure. This wasn't a sensor glitch. This wasn't a bad reading from a faulty instrument. This wasn't supposed to happen at all. Because somewhere on the ground, a man had already written down exactly what was happening. Page by page, warning by warning, and no one had listened. 2 weeks earlier, this exact aircraft had passed every inspection, every system cleared. The pre-flight checks had been completed on schedule. The technical team had gone through every item on the list: hydraulics, electronics, navigation, pressure response. All of it signed off. All of it approved. Except one man refused to sign off on it. He wasn't a commander. He wasn't an engineer. He didn't have a title that made people stop what they were doing and pay attention. To most people on the base, he was just an old mechanic. The kind of man who had been around so long, people stopped seeing him. The kind of man who knew where every cable ran, every valve sat, every seal had been replaced. Not because he had studied it in a classroom, but because he had worked on it with his hands for decades. He had been working on systems like this long before most of them were even trained. And he noticed something no one else did. Not a dramatic fault, not something that would light up a diagnostic screen, just something he felt, something that didn't sit right. And in 30 years of working on aircrafts, that feeling had never once been wrong. It wasn't obvious. Not a broken part. Not a visible fault. Not the kind of problem that shows up in a standard checklist. It was a pattern. A subtle delay in how the system responded under pressure. Under normal operating conditions, everything looked fine. The readings were within range. The response times were technically acceptable. Nothing would have flagged in a routine audit. Most people wouldn't have seen it. But he did. Because he hadn't been looking at the readings. He had been watching the system itself. The physical behavior. The timing. The way the pressure built and released, just a fraction slower than it should have. Not enough to trigger an alarm, but enough, if you knew what you were looking at, to know that something was wrong. So he wrote a report, clear, direct, without exaggeration. He documented the delay he had observed. He noted the specific conditions under which it appeared. He ran through the sequence of events that would follow if those conditions were met mid-flight. He warned that under certain conditions, the system could fail mid-flight. Not might, could. And if it did, the failure would not be gradual. It would not give the pilot time to adjust. It would be sudden, cascading, and nearly impossible to recover from in the air. He submitted the report through the proper channels, attached his observations, requested a secondary review, and then, He waited. The report was reviewed. And then dismissed. The response came back through the same channels. Professional, polite, and completely dismissive. Too unlikely, too rare, too theoretical. The reviewers had looked at the data. They had checked the diagnostic logs. They had cross-referenced the response times against the acceptable thresholds. And on paper, everything was within limits. But to him, it wasn't theory. He had seen this behavior before. Not on this exact system, but on something similar. Years ago, under different conditions. And that time, no one had caught it either. He tried again. He requested a meeting. He went through his observations one more time. He brought the data. He explained the failure sequence step by step. If this system fails, you won't have time to recover. They told him he was overthinking. They told him the system had been certified, that it had passed every required test, that his concerns, while noted, did not meet the threshold for grounding the aircraft. He left that meeting and wrote one more note. Not for them, for the record, because 30 years had taught him one thing, that the record always matters eventually. The aircraft was cleared for operation. No delay. No additional checks. No follow-up on the report. And the mission began. The first few minutes were normal. All systems reading stable. Altitude climbing as expected. Navigation locked. Pressure systems holding. Minutes into the flight, the first system dropped. Not a full failure. A lag. A hesitation in the response. Exactly the kind he had described. Then another. Control response began to lag. The inputs were going in, but the system was taking just a moment too long to process them. A moment that at 40,000 feet feels like an eternity. Navigation became unstable. The positioning data started to drift. Small corrections were triggering larger responses. The system was fighting itself. And then, the exact failure he described happened. Not almost. Not something similar. Exactly. In the sequence he had written down. In the conditions he had warned about. 2 weeks earlier. In a report that had been marked as too theoretical. Back on the ground. Confusion. No clear diagnosis. No immediate solution. No one looking at their screens had a ready answer for what they were seeing. Engineers scrambled. Systems were analyzed. Logs were pulled. Readings were compared against baselines. Nothing made sense. Because they were looking for a failure they recognized. A fault type they had trained for. A scenario that existed in their response playbook. But this one didn't. Not in any manual they had studied. Not in any simulation they had run. Until someone found the report. The one they ignored. A junior technician, going through archive submissions looking for anything that might help them understand what was happening. And there it was. Filed. Reviewed. Dismissed. And now, describing in precise detail exactly what was happening 40,000 feet above them. And suddenly, everything matched. The delay he had observed, the pressure behavior he had documented, the cascade sequence he had predicted, all of it, sitting in a report that had been marked too unlikely. They brought him in immediately. No explanation needed. The technician who found the report had already called ahead. By the time he arrived at the operations room, every screen was showing him the data he had already expected. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. He didn't say a word about the report, about being ignored, about what could have been done differently. He already knew what was happening. He had known from the moment his phone rang, before they said a word, before they showed him a single screen, because this was why he had written the report. Not to be right, not to prove a point, but because somewhere in the back of his mind, he had always known it might come to this. Because he had seen something like this before, decades ago. A different aircraft, a different system, a different team that had also looked at the data and decided the risk was theoretical. That time, the outcome had been different. That time, they hadn't caught it in time. He never forgot what that felt like. And he had spent every year since then making sure he never had to feel it again. He looked at the screens for less than a minute. He confirmed the altitude, the pressure readings, the sequence of system drops, a flaw in how the system handled pressure changes. Rare, but when triggered, catastrophic. The system had been designed with a pressure compensation loop. Under normal flight conditions, that loop ran without issue. But at a specific altitude, combined with a specific rate of climb, the loop began to overcorrect, sending conflicting signals through connected systems, each one responding to the last signal, which was already wrong. A cascade, exactly as he had written. He gave one instruction: reduce system load, manually. Not a complex procedure, not a technical override that required special authorization, just a deliberate step back from the automated loop. Force the system to stop compensating and let the pilot take direct control. The pilot followed, one system at a time, methodical, exactly as instructed. And slowly, control returned. The pressure reading stabilized. The navigation data corrected itself. The lag in the control response disappeared. The aircraft was still in the air. The pilot was still in control. And the one instruction that had made the difference had come from a man who wasn't supposed to be in that room. The aircraft landed safely. No announcement. No press release. No ceremony. No recognition. The pilot filed his report. The engineers updated the maintenance protocol. The system was flagged for review. And somewhere in an archive, a second report was filed. This one, with a very different outcome marked at the top. He drove home that evening the same way he always did. No fanfare. No recognition. Just a quiet understanding. The kind that only comes from knowing what almost happened. There's a certain kind of knowledge that doesn't fit into a report. It doesn't fit into a checklist. It doesn't show up in a diagnostic log. It lives in the hands of people who have been doing something long enough to feel when something is wrong before they can explain why. And the dangerous thing is not that this knowledge is rare. The dangerous thing is how often it gets ignored. Not out of malice, not because the people in charge didn't care, but because experience without credentials is easy to dismiss. Because a feeling without a formula doesn't look like data. Because a warning from someone who has been around long enough to know can look a lot like an old man worrying too much. But the one man they ignored was the only one who could have saved them. And he had written it all down 2 weeks earlier in a report they had marked too theoretical.